Hello, and welcome to another episode of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. I have five of my mammals circled around me right now. The cockatiel, of course, can't. He's in a cage. For whatever reason, my mammals all want to circle around me right now. So they might make cameos any second now. So, one of the things I've been binging lately, just as part of my obsessive craft fixation, um, is Toni Morrison novels. Because one of my big projects is writing 31 stories based on different prompts that I've gathered. 23 prompts and 8 unsolicited but inspired prompts. One of the prompts I got was Midwest, which is strangely the most difficult one I've had to deal with compared to the other ones. I had a lot of the prompts I've been dealing with, like the one I mentioned last episode, for my story "Mother's Little Helper." That was a very complicated prompt, but I came up with a story pretty quickly with that for that one. I don't know if I can even summarize what that prompt was, but Midwest is such a simple prompt, but I really struggled with coming up with a good story for it. And the first, I'm not sure exactly how I'll structure it, but the first story I came up with ended up being much more of a Murakami sort of a story. I don't know how that happened. I sort of imagined Midwest being a imaginary place. I mean, that was a little bit easier because I don't know anything about the Midwest, so I tried to imagine the Midwest as this magical place, and I was kind of struggling to really make that one work. Um, but the person who gave me the Midwest, I'm keeping all of that anonymous as much as I can. The person who gave me that prompt is a big fan of Toni Morrison, so I really wanted to dive into. I've talked about this in previous episodes a little bit, but really wanted to dive into how exactly Toni Morrison works. So partly that's on the prose level, and I'll do an episode about that one of these days soon. But another is on the plotting level because she does have an interesting way of plotting that I find fascinating. Um, and So the last one that I was diving into, I'm doing this by audiobook, so there's some limitations there. I mean, I have to do this by audiobook by necessity, so that should be the caveat just going into this. But the last one I dove into was Sula. I have the audiobook for Home now, so that's the next one that I'm diving into. And so Sula is fascinating. I mean, read plenty of them before, and so it's not my first Toni Morrison. I want to make sure that's clear, but I was not familiar with Sula before diving into it recently. Uh, but one of the things that I was interested in was the plotting, because one of the comparisons that people make with Toni Morrison, I don't know how accurate this is, but this is in people writing about her. Sometimes this will come up. People will say Toni Morrison uh, plots a lot like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so they'll make that sort of comparison. They have a whole complicated history too, so it's not an arbitrary comparison. Um, so if you look at 100 Years of Solitude, basically what 100 Years of Solitude does is creates this setting, and you have these very episodic sort of storylines for a wide variety of different characters within this setting. And it's not necessarily just an overarching plot that necessarily ties all of them together. There will be patterns. So, sort of plotting based on an episodic plotting with patterns more so than an actual sort of through line plot. And it's not really a filmic sort of a structure. And I think that's, for whatever reason, became fixated on that. But a filmic structure will, a traditional 3-act structure, 5-act structure, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of Toni Morrison movies except Beloved. You don't see a lot of Gabriel Garcia Marquez movies. Um, it would work better as a TV show. I think both cases, it probably would work better as a TV show because it is fairly episodic. But one of the patterns that you see in a lot of Toni Morrison plots is that she'll have a different setting. She doesn't, just from my experience, she doesn't do nearly as many generations as 100 Years of Solitude does. Just in the ones I've read so far. But she'll have a lot of characters within the setting. Usually she'll fixate on two really central characters. That seems like, two people who have this really complicated sort of a bond. And so different sort of interactions that they have over the years, not necessarily introducing one complication at the beginning that gets resolved at the end, not that sort of filmic structure where, they have to solve this mystery, they have to, one of the questions to ask at the beginning of a Toni Morrison novel is to say, what does the character actually want? What is driving the character forward? That's not really even an interest for the characters. I mean, that they are complicated characters. They have all kinds of different things going on. That really simplified filmic sort of a structure. You have a character with, depending on how complicated the character is, you have a character with a set of desires that they meet these obstacles and then resolve them. But if you look at Sula, what does Sula desire? You look at Nell, what does she desire? There's a lot of complicated things. So there's not that sort of through line plot. There's not sort of the rising action. There's not the direct conflicts that keep the character from achieving their goals. But I think that's an interesting thing to observe about that, is to say, compare what Toni Morrison does in plotting to common plotting advice. And I think common plotting advice is wrong except for a limited amount of circumstances. So you'll see, you'll read a lot of these creative writing textbooks that will say, here's how you do plot. The character should want something. And the character, especially in film plotting, it's much more of a rigid sort of a thing in film plotting where, they'll say, this is what should happen in Act 1, and here's what should happen in Act 2. And sure, that works for movies. But there's a difference between something working commonly and something being a necessity. So anytime you claim it's a necessity that here's what should happen in Act 1, I would certainly question that as advice. If you say, this is the advice that you hear a lot. This character should want something, and that should be consistent throughout the text and be resolved by the end. Well, that's silly. That's, of course, not a universal. It works. If you want to spice up a character and you're not quite sure how to, throw in, a particular desire. I think something that works really well for a character is to want something but want the opposite at the same time. I think that really gives a character lots of dynamics. And it's kind of hard to identify that with Sula or Nell. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily universal. I would say that's a much more potent way to develop a character than merely saying, character should always want something. And I've complained about that with Kurt Vonnegut. As much as I love Kurt Vonnegut, his advice is a character should want something, even a glass of water, which is terrible advice. Or not. It's entirely possible for a character not to want something, or for it to be kind of hard to identify what the character wants. But one of the things about Sula, it's beautiful prose, really complicated characters. By the end, I was sort of had this unidentifiable feeling by the end, where it wasn't quite satisfying the way it ended. That's not I'm not claiming that as a universal. I'm not saying Sula's a really bad novel because I wasn't satisfied by the end. I might have talked before about my experience with The Fixer by Bernard Malamud, where by the end of that book, I hated it because it, left me with this, unidentifiable sort of a feeling. So I looked for some reviews of Sula, and I came across a really interesting example of precisely what I'm saying. People coming up with false universals in order to really deal with unidentifiable feelings. And I think really my feeling at the end of Sula was just in that it was plotted sort of in the inverse of that sort of filmic structure, which is not a bad thing. It's just sort of is unsettling. So the filmic structure, it builds you up really really gradually, gives you a climax, and then sort of releases that tension. And last episode, I was talking about Harry Potter. Harry Potter books are written very, very much in that structure where everything really, really significant happens at the end of the school year. Everything culminates at the end of the school year. And it's a really satisfying structure. As I said, it's a very comforting structure. The structure of Sula was unsettling. Then that doesn't mean bad, it just means unsettling. Because he had all of these really, really awful things happen. Really, there was no resolution for them. It sort of just left them unresolved, arguably. The feeling was that they were unresolved. And that was the feeling I had at the end of The Fixer. I mean, this is why I had, at first I hated The Fixer and then I loved it. But Yakov Bach had all these really awful things happen to him. And there was no resolution for it. It was just left unresolved. And so I was sort of unsettled by, you have these really intense tragedies really at the beginning, roughly, early on in the book. But in the end, so it was sort of like spike of intense tragedy, and then the end, it was sort of gradually dwindling, which can work fine. I've talked about that with A Hunger Artist. Hunger Artist, one of my favorite stories, but it's sort of just starts here and then degenerates, or The Metamorphosis is another basic example of that. So it was an unsettling feeling, but not necessarily a flaw in the book. So I was trying to find reviews to see if how other people responded to that, and I found an interesting review, and I'll leave it anonymous as well, because I don't think it was a really well done review. So I'm not criticizing this person necessarily, but it is a common sort of response to a text. Maggie's making a cameo, and they're all asleep now, so I don't know how many are really going to make a cameo, but all of my mammals are surrounding me, and all of them are asleep except Bo. She's just sitting there, next to the window in the sunshine. It's nice and warm. And this is going to be a point in a second. So I saw this review. It was interesting how this person just didn't connect with the characters. I mean, ultimately, that's what I would say this person's issue was. She was doing a negative review. She just didn't like Sula at all. And I would say the main thing that I would identify as a problem is just entirely on a personal level. She didn't connect with the characters. So she, all the characters are doing bad things. So it was, she just, Sula does all kinds of really terrible things. She's an interesting, complicated character, but she's not a morally upstanding character necessarily. But so that was sort of just turned off this particular reviewer. And so she went through this whole gamut of all these different responses that were really fascinating. One of them was, she kept saying we as human beings, which is one of those responses when you dislike something, you go to the human condition thing. And the human condition thing is a pet peeve of mine, but it usually is nonsense when I hear it. Like the other day I heard, somebody was talking about a horror movie or something like that. And they said, well, it's not a deep analysis of the human condition. Why does any movie need to be a deep analysis of the human condition? What does that even mean? It's a term that is so meaningless that is used so frequently that it's entirely impractical. It's as if you're saying something just to say something. If I had a really good, clear analytical principle based on that concept of deep analysis of the human condition being the principle by which we judge all high-quality texts, then I could refute that, but there's nothing there to really refute anyway. It was entirely meaningless. So this particular reviewer, it's fascinating. I guess this is kind of straw manning because this is not really a good review, but I'm not saying that she's a terrible human being or anything like that. I'm just saying that this is the sort of response that comes up when you have sort of a difficult emotional response to something and you're struggling to really come up with a good answer for it. But she's saying we as human beings want to get something out of a text, which is sort of a tautological statement of it. I didn't get anything out of it because all people want to get something out of the text. Well, what does that even mean? That's sort of like that claim about the human condition. What does the human condition actually mean? Why do we need a deep analysis of the human condition? But if you really break that down, based on the rainbow circle, if you break that down to what I would argue is the prime value. The prime value is emotional response. So if you don't connect with the characters, you're not going to have the same sort of emotional response that if you do connect with the characters. And connecting doesn't have to mean you support them. I mean, Sula, interesting, fascinating character, elicits all of these intense emotional responses from all of the terrible things she does. But if that reaches such a degree that you can't, that you just shut off and you dismiss her as a character, then that can limit the amount of emotional response you have to her. So that's more of a practical way of really considering what's going on in that text. Bo is now cleaning my arm. Bo, hey Bo, you want to make a cameo? You want to make a cameo? You're just sitting there off camera. Well, anyway, I'm talking about complicated ladies, and you're a complicated lady. So anyway, so you have a character like that. I mean, so you can see that, and you could say, a story should have a moral, like Sula does bad things and she gets punished for it. That's the moral. Therefore, me feeling all these complicated feelings for Sula is not a moral problem with me, because by the end of the text she's punished, and so that teaches me the lesson about what good and bad are. And that, I would say that would be a concept that I could refute, but just saying human condition, we want to get something out of it. There's really nothing there to refute. And then, so structure is my main point. So she had these claims about how a story should be structured, which were interesting. She had a metaphor where she said, story should be, I'm not sure if she came up with this or she got this somewhere, but story should be structured like the 4 seasons, where it goes from fall, then declines into winter, there's rebirth in the spring, and then summer is the reward. As a Southerner, summer is the worst month. Summer is the month of punishment and torture. So I would say maybe spring. And it was spring, and if you want a happy ending. But that's the sort of response people have with like unusual structure. I wouldn't say it's an unusual structure. I mean, there's plenty of stories that are structured like it, but certainly Toni Morrison has a particular style with the way she structures the text that are, she uses in a lot of her novels, but that sort of episodic structure is not extremely experimental necessarily, but it's certainly idiosyncratic to Toni Morrison. So if you see a structure like that, your main reason for responding to the novel is based on your connection with the character, but in this negative response, you have this post-rationalization. And I've talked about post-rationalization in a lot of episodes before, but post-rationalization basically meaning you have this irrational, visceral response to a text, arguably based on inability to connect with the characters. You come up with some explanation for why you have this negative response, and you say, it must have been the structure. Viewing the structure, you say, the structure was a problem because here's what a structure should be. Here's universally what a structure should be. It should be formed like a year, where you have this steady decline, this steady cyclical decline into winter, and then you have this rebirth into spring. Let's give it the southern version and say spring would be the happy ending. Summer would be the torturous negative beginning that we're trying to escape from with the gloriousness of autumn. Here in winter, and it's nice and warm. It's the perfect temperature at the moment. In December, in the beginning of December. But so that's kind of the sequence that you encounter when it comes to these false concepts of the what a story should universally be. So you go from what is legitimately the universal valuation, which is the irrational, entirely subjective response to a text. I dislike this for this reason because I had this negative emotional response, or I failed to have any sort of emotional response. The next step is post-rationalization, where I have to explain why did I have this negative response. I'll come up with an explanation, whether or not it's valid. The actual valid explanation is that it's irrational, but here's an explanation that whether or not it's valid, that settles my uncertainty about why I had this negative response. It takes the irrational and turns it into rational, even if it's false. So I didn't connect with these characters and must have something to do with the structure. You go from that post-rationalization to a false universal. So the structure of it was sort of episodic, where tragedy happens at the beginning, it sort of peters out at the end. The universal of what a story should be is that it should have the cyclical structure where you have a happy ending or whatever. And so you end up with all these false universals. And I think that's commonly what tends to happen. If you read any sort of creative writing textbook, any sort of textbook about writing, you'll have all of these just false universals based on just entirely incorrect post-rationalizations. But what they actually mean, if to really interpret, here's the meta-interpretation of these post-rationalizations. What they really mean is just, I as an individual had this particularly individual subjective response to this thing, and here's the type of story that I as an individual like. Most of those sorts of advice lists and books and what have you are really just lists of things I personally prefer, quote unquote. So yeah, I would think a valid response, a much more valid sort of response. My response to Sula was that it didn't quite work for me. But I would recognize what does work and why particular things don't work for just me as an individual, so that I can learn and process them for creating. My goal is to create my own Toni Morrison type story. And I think the Toni Morrison type story that I started writing is called Salt in the Wound. And I just want the type of story structure I like is that sort of climactic structure, the building towards a climax sort of a structure. I just like that. It's not to say that that's the best thing to do. I'm just saying, entirely as an individual, here's a cameo from Boots, who is stretching. He's been sitting on my lap for a couple hours as I grade papers all Sunday long during finals time. This is my break from grading papers. So, hey Boots, you making a cameo? my old man cat. I've had him for, I think he's 14 now. My old man cat. Just likes to sit on my lap for hours and hours while I grade papers. So anyway, so one of the things is just in writing my story, Salt in the Wound, and I sort of turned it into a science fiction type of thing, just for fun. And the person who gave me the prompt also likes Afrofuturism is kind of a concept that she deals with. So I was like, let me riff on Toni Morrison and make it sort of sci-fi. But I've already just, whenever I plot something, I sort of have the whole concept of the plot. Not that I do a whole lot of planning. I do want to open it up for improvisation. But usually plotting, if something comes to me, I'll have some, story beats that show up. And so Salt in the Wound, this story that I started writing, I'm not sure if that's a working title. I'm not sure if that's going to be the final title. The plot concept I have of it, I realized just looking at all of these beats that it is going to be more of a filmic sort of a structure where it builds to a climax. And Toni Morrison does that. Look at Beloved or something like that. Beloved being one of the very few that I know of, film adaptations of Toni Morrison. So maybe I'll use that as a model. A lot of Salt in the Wound. I was riffing on sort of the Sula idea. There are two childhood friends. One of them is sort of like Sula. One of them is sort of like Nell. They have this really complicated relationship. Um, the Sula character does lots of really bad things. Oh, here's another thing. This reviewer said I couldn't understand why Sula did these things. And that's another thing that is another post-rationalization where, you'll hear this in workshops a lot. I don't understand why a particular character did something. Therefore, you have this obligation universally to explain motivations. Which, if you talk about the human condition, knowing the human condition, why does anybody do anything? But I think with Sula, I think my interpretation is just that there's so many horrible, horrible things that happen to the both of the characters that they process it in radically different ways. One of them processes the horrible things by becoming promiscuous and dismissive of other people's feelings and cold and all this sort of stuff. Sula, whereas Nell processes it in a very different way. And so in Salt in the Wound, I have two characters who go through these really traumatic experiences when they're kids, and then they end up processing it very different ways. But plot wise, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, just based on my concept, I might end up having to follow more of the beloved sort of plotting, where there is definitely a through line plot. There's a mystery, there's a conflict with the two main or three main characters have this conflict. There's a fairly steady rising tension. There's a climax, all that sort of stuff. It's a very satisfying sort of a structure. Um, Not a universal structure, not something that you have to always use. It's something that works. And I think that's a much better way of thinking of plotting is um, what actually works more so than what is always absolutely necessary. That's sort of ridiculous. All plots can work. But if you want to write a story and know all the different possibilities of what can work, you can look at your really traditional sort of filmic structure. It can work just fine. Or you can look at, the more episodic sort of a structure, which works perfectly fine. Lots and lots of really magnificent novels are written that way. But anyway, enough rambling. I will see you on the next episode. My very stripy face. I kind of like the weird lighting effects of this spot this time of day. See you next time.